Welcome. You're watching Animal Attacks. Today, I'm going to show you some of the most brutal and horrifying animal attacks the United States has ever seen. From a man who spent 2 years hand-feeding a wild bear until one missing apple ended the routine in the worst possible way, to a man who walked out of his bathroom and found his escaped pet lion waiting in the hallway.
It was June 7th, 2026 in northwestern Montana, and the trail they normally used was washed out before they even reached the first bend. Aldrich Renshaw was 46 years old and had been working in wildlife management for more than 2 decades. He knew the backcountry the way people know a neighborhood they have lived in for years. Not perfectly, but well enough that comfort had settled in over time. His personal life had been harder than his work life for the past several years. A divorce had put distance between him and his 2 sons, and the previous night his former wife had called to tell him their older boy had been admitted to hospital in critical condition after an accident.
Aldrich had told his crew he needed to finish one last assignment before driving to the airport. He had packed a bag before leaving the field station that morning.
I think about that phone call the night before, his son in hospital, and he still showed up to do the job the next morning. That tells you something about the kind of man he was. Oswin Desai was 31 years old and had come to Montana from India after years of studying bears at university. And Coltrane Ruffey was 28 and had joined the team only a few months earlier. Before sunrise, the 3 of them left the field station to replace memory cards and batteries in a remote research camera positioned above a salmon stream. They had completed the same job several times that spring as part of an ongoing grizzly monitoring project. It was the kind of task that stops feeling like a task after you have done it enough times. The rain overnight had washed out part of the normal trail. Aldrich looked at the muddy section and suggested cutting through a thick patch of alder to go around it. It would save a few minutes, and the alder route would bring them out close to the camera site anyway.
He forgot his bear spray clipped to the driver's door of the truck instead of transferring to his belt before they started walking.
The camera site was close. They would not be long. That is something about dangerous environments I don't like. It does not eliminate the risk. It just makes it easier to forget the risk is still there. What none of them knew was that a sow grizzly had dragged the remains of an elk carcass into that same patch of alder during the night and had bedded down nearby with her 2 yearling cubs. Grizzly bears are acutely protective of food sources and will defend a carcass with the same intensity they bring to defending cubs, and both were involved in this case. The alder closed around them as they pushed through. Visibility dropped to a few feet in every direction. The stream was loud enough that conversation required raised voices. None of them heard anything before the sow came out of the cover at a distance too short for any of them to do anything useful with the seconds they had. The bear went for Aldrich first. The charge covered the remaining distance in under 2 seconds, and the impact of nearly 400 pounds hitting a standing person at full speed drove him backward off his feet and into the brush before he could raise his arms. She pinned him with her front paws and bit into the back of his skull. The cracking sound was immediate. He stopped moving after the second bite. Oswin had pushed sideways into the alder, trying to create distance, but the vegetation grabbed at her legs and slowed her within the first few feet. The sow covered the gap before she cleared the brush line.
The first contact came at her shoulder and spun her into the ground. The bear bit into her upper back and broke her spine.
Oswin could not move her lower body after it. She was still conscious and breathing when the sow left her. Coltrane made it further than either of them. He was pushing uphill through the lodgepole when she caught him at the back of the thigh and pulled him down the slope. He went face first into the ground, and she bit into the base of his neck once before something, a sound from the cubs, pulled her back toward the carcass. The bite tore deep into the muscles of his neck and shoulder, but missed the major blood vessel. Bleeding heavily wobbly and barely conscious. He remained motionless until the bear disappeared back into the alder. Other workers at the station grew concerned when the team did not return at the expected time and could not be raised on the radio. A search was organized and responders were sent into the area with the truck's last known coordinates as a starting point. They found Aldrich dead near the camera site. Oswin was still alive but critically injured and unable to move below her chest. Coltrane was found badly mauled, conscious, and suffering severe blood loss. Both survivors were flown to hospital. Despite emergency treatment, Oswin died from her injuries later that day. Coltrane underwent multiple surgeries and survived after a long recovery. The bear spray was still clipped to the driver's door. Aldrich had a bag packed for the airport. His son was waiting in a hospital, and the bear spray never left the truck. I cannot read this case without sitting with that for a long time. Wildlife officials who reviewed the incident noted that the detour through the alder had brought the team directly into a food defense situation at close range with no warning and no deterrent available. The sow and her cubs were located 2 days later in the same drainage and were relocated rather than removed. September 12, 2015. Clear skies over Franklin County, Kentucky. Oak Valley Wildlife Park was already moving through its morning routine when Thomas Caldwell, 52 years old and a veteran keeper at the facility, walked into the yard to start his shift. Caldwell had spent years working with exotic animals at the park. Among his regular responsibilities was a 10-year-old male Grevy's zebra named Zuri. Zuri was not a passive background animal. He was part of Caldwell's daily routine, which meant Caldwell understood what he was dealing with. The park's standard safety procedures required that any keeper working near Zuri's area had to confirm double-gated separation before entering the adjoining yard. No direct contact without a secured barrier confirmed between the animal and the person. That requirement existed specifically because of animals like Zuri. His record included documented episodes of aggression. Staff at the facility were aware of it. This was not new information to anyone working around. I guess this is where perception and reality don't always match.
Most people wouldn't immediately think of zebras as dangerous, but that doesn't change what the animal is capable of in the right situation.
On the morning of September 12th, Caldwell was in the yard directly adjoining Zuri's stall. A wheelbarrow, a rake, and a shovel were found nearby, which places him in the middle of cleaning work. The gate separating the two spaces had not been confirmed secured before Caldwell entered the area. The investigation that followed pointed to a procedural shortcut during the morning transition between enclosure checks. Not a mechanical failure, not a broken latch, a step that was not completed before a keeper entered a space next to a documented aggressive animal. Zuri moved through the open gate. Grevy's zebras are the largest zebra species in the world. Adult males weigh close to 900 pounds. In the wild, stallions use kicks and bites to fight rival males over territory, and they do not hold back when they do it. A single kick from an animal this size carries enough force to fracture bone and rupture organs on impact. Their bite, built to tear through tough vegetation, causes deep tissue damage when it connects with a person. Zuri had already shown he was willing to use that aggression.
The attack lasted seconds. Zuri moved with sudden explosive force, closing the distance before Caldwell had time to react or get clear.
The animal delivered a severe kick to Caldwell's torso, the full weight and momentum of a 900-pound animal driving into him. Caldwell went down immediately. The impact caused catastrophic internal trauma, fractured ribs, and damage to internal organs. Internal bleeding began right away and could not be stopped in time at the scene. He never got back up on his own. A volunteer keeper aide and other staff nearby reacted quickly. They used distraction to move Zuri into a separate secured part of the enclosure. The animal was contained shortly after. By the time they reached Caldwell, he was on the ground and still conscious but badly hurt. He was taken to a nearby hospital for emergency treatment. The injuries from that one kick caused severe internal damage. Despite treatment, Thomas Caldwell later died from his injuries at the hospital. The Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources investigated the incident and attributed the cause to human error. The gate separation requirement had not been followed correctly before Caldwell entered the adjoining yard. Zuri's aggression history was on record. The safety step was clearly defined.
The gap between what the protocol required and what actually happened that morning is the entire story.
I found this case difficult to look at because nothing about it was unknown. The animal's history was documented. The procedure existed for a specific reason. Everyone on that staff understood the risk, and still, on a routine morning, one confirmation step was skipped. That gap was all it took. It was June 9th, 2016. Bodega Bay sits about 60 miles north of San Francisco, along the Northern California coast. That morning, swells were running 2 to 3 feet, and the water was cold and stained green-brown from coastal upwelling. Jeff Nolan was 51 and had been running kayak fishing trips out of Bodega Bay for nearly a decade. He knew the nearshore reef structures well enough to put clients on fish consistently. His client that morning was a 46-year-old software engineer from Sacramento who had booked the trip as a birthday gift to himself. He had kayaked before, but never in the open ocean. Jeff had gone over the basics before they launched. The client was wearing a personal flotation device. Jeff was not. They launched at 7:15 from a small gravel beach north of the harbor and paddled about a mile offshore to a reef Jeff knew well. By 9 o'clock, both had landed 2 fish stored in mesh bags trailing beside their kayaks. At around 9:20, the client mentioned seeing something large pass beneath his kayak. Jeff saw nothing and suggested it was probably a halibut or a leopard shark. 10 minutes later, Jeff felt a firm push from below. He looked into the dark water, saw nothing, and pulled his catch bag onto his lap. That's one of the unsettling things about kayak fishing. You're close enough to the water to feel what's beneath you, but not necessarily to see it. He told the client they would move in a few minutes, then made one last cast. Great white sharks have highly developed olfactory systems capable of detecting blood and organic compounds in concentrations as low as 1 part per million, allowing them to track potential food sources from considerable distances. The strike came at 9:37. The shark hit the underside of Jeff's kayak hard enough to lift the stern from the water and roll it sideways. Jeff surfaced beside the overturned hull and managed to get it partially upright before the shark returned. This time, it did not hit the kayak. It came from below and behind Jeff's position in the water, and the bite closed around his lower torso, from the lower back through to the front of the abdomen. The force drove him downward and backward simultaneously, and his grip on the hull broke. He went under and did not come back up. The client was about 30 feet away. He saw Jeff's hands come off the kayak, and then there was nothing, just the empty hull drifting upright and a dark spread moving across the surface where Jeff had been. The client did not enter the water. Given the shark was still somewhere in the area, there was little else he could safely do. He held both kayaks together and reached for his cell phone, which was in a waterproof case clipped to his life jacket. It took him 3 attempts to get the call through. The rescue vessel arrived at 10:18, 37 minutes after the call connected at 9:41. The client had been alone on the water for close to 40 minutes by the time help reached him. A surface search that afternoon found no sign of Jeff. The following morning, a dive team located his body in 41 feet of water, roughly 300 yards from where the kayak had capsized. Visibility underwater was poor, and the recovery took several hours. The post-mortem examination found that the bite had destroyed both iliac vessels and caused extensive damage to the abdominal cavity. The coroner determined that the blood loss was unsurvivable and that drowning occurred alongside the hemorrhage rather than afterward. The report also identified the absence of a personal flotation device as a contributing factor. Trailing fish bags in the water alongside the kayaks was also noted, as it could attract great white shark from a considerable distance. Jeff's fishing rod was recovered floating about half a mile south of the capsized site the following afternoon. The client's account and the physical evidence were sufficient to establish the full sequence of events. The case was ruled an accidental death. I keep thinking about the fact that Jeff's job was taking people out on the water and bringing them back. In the end, he was the one they had to go looking for. It was March 22nd, 2014, on a private animal ranch near Lake Okeechobee, Florida, and the property was quiet the way it usually was on a weekday afternoon. Jorik Caius was 47 years old and had spent the better part of his adult life building the ranch from open land into something people drove from nearby towns to visit. He owned antelope, exotic birds, and several large animals across the property.
But the animal that drew the most attention and the one Jorik spoke about most was a hippopotamus named Titan.
He had acquired Titan when the animal was still young enough to be handled without much difficulty and had raised him through every stage of growth. By the time Titan reached adulthood, he weighed somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 pounds. Jorik had never adjusted the way he thought about him. He fed Titan by hand, walked beside him along the water's edge, posed for photographs with him, and regularly told visitors that the hippo was like a son to him. When wildlife experts warned him that the relationship carried serious risk, he dismissed it the same way every time. He believed the years of care he had put into raising Titan had produced something that the standard warnings did not account for. There had been signs that complicated that belief. Calling an animal that size a son tells me everything about how far the line had blurred for Jorik. That language was not casual. It was how he genuinely saw the relationship. Several months before the incident,
A visitor and his young grandson wandered too close to Titan while exploring part of the ranch.
the hippo charged at them without warning and forced both of them to climb a nearby tree while ranch workers rushed to intervene. Jorik described it afterward as a misunderstanding. Not long after that, Titan pushed through a damaged section of fencing and wandered onto a neighboring golf course, sending golfers running before workers guided him back to the property. Farmers nearby had also reported finding livestock injured or dead close to the ranch boundary, damage they attributed to the hippo. Whether every report was accurate or not, the pattern was visible to everyone around Jorik. He did not change anything. I think at this point, he should have considered not keeping, but the hippo stayed anyway. On the afternoon of March 22nd, he went down to the lakeside area of the ranch where Titan spent most of his time. It was a routine he had followed more times than he could count, and nothing about the day appeared different from any other. He was still sitting close to the water, playing with Titan. Then it moved without warning from the water's edge. The initial charge covered the distance between them in seconds.
The hippo's jaw came down on Jorik's lower torso, and the force of the bite was immediate and catastrophic.
The impact drove him to the ground, and the animal followed through with a second strike before he could move. He had no realistic chance of getting clear once Titan was on him. Hours later, family members noticed he had not returned to the house, and ranch workers began searching the property. They found Jorik near the shoreline, and emergency services were called immediately. He was found without signs of life, and responders were unable to revive him. The coroner attributed his death to injuries sustained during an encounter with Titan. Wildlife specialists who reviewed the case noted that the behavioral pattern leading up to the incident had been consistent with a hippo reasserting territorial boundaries around its water source. Titan had never stopped being a hippopotamus. Jorik had simply never allowed himself to accept what that meant. It was June 11th, 2016, in a remote national park in Washington, and the trail was quiet, the way it usually is on a clear weekday morning. Corvin Ashford was 45 years old and worked as an electrician. Weekends outdoors were not something he had to be talked into.
Hiking had been part of his life long enough that it had shaped the most important parts of it.
He and his wife had met through a local hiking club years earlier, gone on their first date on a mountain trail, and eventually married at a scenic overlook. 10 years later, they still chose trails over restaurants and national parks over resorts. A relationship that started on a mountain trail and kept going back there for 10 years. That kind of life built around one shared thing is rare, and I think about what it costs to lose it on one of those same trails. Park rules require dogs to remain on a leash. The couple had let the dog walk ahead off leash on previous trips without any problems and had become comfortable with it over time.
Nothing had ever gone wrong, and the rule had started to feel like something that applied more to other situations than to theirs.
That morning felt the same as every other. The weather was clear, the trail was quiet, and they passed only a handful of other hikers in the first stretch. As they moved through a wooded section, the dog ran further ahead than usual and disappeared around a bend in the trail. Seconds later, they heard barking. Then something heavy moved through the brush. The dog came back around the bend at a full run. A large black bear was right behind it. The bear was not coming for the couple. It had been startled by the dog somewhere ahead on the trail and was chasing the animal that had surprised it. The dog was fast and the bear was focused entirely on it. In a different set of seconds, the bear might have followed the dog off the trail and into the trees, and the whole thing would have ended without contact. A few seconds in a different direction and they walk home with a story. That is the entire margin between a close call and what actually happened. Corvin stepped forward. He saw the dog coming toward him and moved to put himself in a position to use his bear spray, trying to create enough time for the dog to get behind them before he discharged it. It was a decision made in a fraction of a second, and it placed him directly in the path of a bear that was already in full pursuit. The bear reached him before it reached the dog.
The bear struck at a running speed during the chase, and the force of the impact alone was enough to cause serious injury.
Corvin was knocked hard to the ground, and the bear, now startled by the unexpected contact with a person, reacted with a single bite to his upper body before breaking off and disappearing into the forest. The entire encounter lasted only a few seconds. His wife was off the trail when it happened and was not injured. The dog ran past them both and was completely unharmed. Other hikers who heard the shouting called emergency services, and park rangers and paramedics reached the trail as quickly as the terrain allowed. They found Corvin with critical injuries to his chest and upper body from both the impact and the bite. Treatment began on the trail and continued through transport, but the damage was too severe to stabilize. Corvin Ashford died from his injuries. Wildlife officers reviewed the incident and determined that the bear had been reacting entirely to the off-leash dog. It had not been following the couple or behaving aggressively toward people. The leash rule that the couple had been comfortable ignoring existed partly for this reason. A dog running loose in bear country can startle an animal and then lead it directly back toward the people it belongs to. The dog was completely unharmed. I sit with that every time I read this case, and I do not know what to do with it. In the weeks that followed, his wife buried him at a small cemetery not far from the overlook where they had gotten married. A few close friends came. She did not say much. There was not a lot to say about 10 years that could fit into that kind of moment. The dog went to a shelter 2 weeks after the funeral because she could not bear having the dog around her.
It was September 11th, 2017, at a regional zoological park in the southwestern United States during a supervised morning program in an open free-contact elephant training yard. Kalen Verreau was 19, there as a volunteer in a wildlife outreach program. He was still new to all of it, so he didn't really handle the elephants directly on his own. Mostly he observed, and only stepped in for short, supervised moments with a young elephant while staff guided everything. The facility had a small group of Asian elephants, including a calf and an adult female. Things there were very structured. It all came down to positioning and cues. Staff guiding the elephants into specific spots using trained signals and targets, keeping everything in place through constant supervision rather than physical separation. So yeah, it was basically this setup where everyone, humans and elephants, was moving within these defined zones, and the staff were always watching and directing how everything lined up and stayed separated, at least from what I could see at the time. During the session, the calf was brought into the central training area for routine conditioning, while the adult female remained in a separate section of the same open enclosure with visual and auditory access. The system relied on trained behavior, stationing cues, and continuous keeper oversight to maintain spacing within a shared open enclosure without physical barriers. Kalen was allowed brief, supervised direct interaction with the calf during a structured handling sequence under keeper instruction, while staff divided their attention between monitoring volunteer positioning and maintaining the elephant's stationing behavior across the broader shared yard. The adult female elephant became increasingly attentive to the interaction involving the calf. As calf vocalization and close human presence continued, her posture and movement shifted toward a protective response pattern consistent with maternal vigilance. As Kalen maintained controlled proximity to the calf under instruction, the adult elephant left her assigned station following a breakdown in stationing compliance and moved toward the handling area within the shared yard. Loss of target focus occurred during simultaneous calf handling, reducing the adult elephant's responsiveness to stationing cues. Her movement was directed toward the calf and surrounding activity rather than exploratory behavior. Within the designated working area of the yard, the escalation occurred quickly. Staff issued repeated verbal halt commands and attempted to re-establish spatial control using target cues and repositioning signals, but the elephant did not return to her assigned stationing point. I think commands don't really land the way people think they do. It's not even about being ignored. It's more like there's no space left for them to matter. Kaylin began to withdraw as instructed, but the available open space and the speed of the animal's approach reduced the distance available for separation. As he moved backward, the adult elephant closed in, compressing the remaining space before safe repositioning could be achieved. Close-range contact occurred, leaving insufficient time for further intervention. Emergency response was initiated immediately. Kaylin sustained severe blunt force and compressive trauma, lost consciousness rapidly, and was pronounced dead after emergency services arrived. The impact resulted in catastrophic compressive trauma to the thoracic region, including rib fractures and severe internal organ injury consistent with high-force blunt impact. An investigation identified a breakdown in spatial supervision and stationing compliance during a multi-animal handling session, including insufficient control of the adult elephant's positioning during calf-focused interaction. No structural or mechanical failures were found. Protocols were later revised to strengthen separation of calf interaction sessions from adult elephant proximity and improve redundancy in stationing control during volunteer-involved handling work.
March 15th, 2018. A warm spring morning settled over Alachua County, Florida, the kind of brightness that makes outdoor work feel easy. On a rural property at the edge of the county, Robert Thornton was already outside and moving through his morning. He had animals to feed and a routine to follow. He had followed it hundreds of times before. Thornton was 52 years old, a retired military veteran who had, in the years after his service, developed a serious interest in exotic birds. He ran a small private sanctuary on his property that housed macaws, parrots, and other rare species. By most accounts, he was knowledgeable and genuinely committed to the care of his collection.
But one animal on that property sat in a completely different category from anything else he kept. A single male southern cassowary named Cain.
I want to highlight something people often overlook. Birds like macaws and parrots usually feel harmless, but a cassowary is in a completely different category. It is large, fast, and built with powerful legs that can cause serious injury. Even animals that don't look dangerous at first glance can still be capable of causing fatal harm if things go wrong. Thornton had acquired Cain as a chick and raised him from the beginning. He had entered Cain's enclosure regularly over the years to perform routine care, feeding and cleaning without consistently using the protective equipment that working around a cassowary requires. He believed the years of proximity had built something between them, that Cain was familiar. That familiarity meant safety. That belief, over time, had quietly removed the caution that should have been present every single time he entered that space. I find this pattern the most unsettling. It is not the wild encounter or the sudden ambush that no one could have seen coming. It is the slow erosion of appropriate caution in the face of a very dangerous animal, happening gradually over time until the day the animal behaves like what it actually is. The southern cassowary is often called the most dangerous bird in the world. A full-grown bird can stand close to 6 feet tall and weigh over 130 pounds. It has strong legs, and each foot carries a long inner claw, almost like a blade, that can grow up to 5 inches. When a cassowary attacks, it doesn't just peck. It can jump forward and kick with its full body weight behind it. That kick is powerful enough to cause serious, sometimes fatal injuries to a person in a single strike. These birds are also very territorial, especially male cassowaries can become very defensive if they feel their space is being entered.
On the morning of the March 15th, Cain was not calm. He was displaying the behavioral signs that anyone trained in working with cassowaries would recognize as a warning.
Kane raised his feathers and made a deep warning sound again. Thornton did not step back. At that moment, the bird moved forward. The cassowary rushed forward and delivered a fast, powerful kick with its leg. The inner claw struck Thornton in the abdomen, causing a deep puncture wound and severe internal injury. The force knocked him off balance and sent him crashing to the ground. He fell hard onto nearby stone ground and struck his head during the fall. A neighbor heard Thornton calling for help and found him on the ground near the enclosure. Emergency services were called right away and arrived quickly, but his condition was critical. He died from his injuries before reaching the hospital. Wildlife officials later reviewed the case. They noted that Thornton had entered the space of a known high-risk animal during a clear display of vegetation without proper protective measures. It was early December 2020 in Yellowstone National Park, Wyoming, and the trail she was on did not appear on any visitor map. Sorrel Vane was 34 years old and had walked away from a marketing job in March, telling people it was a sabbatical while privately working towards something she had wanted for longer than she admitted. She had spent years producing content for other people's brands and had decided she was done with it.
The plan was to build a following around solo backcountry photography.
The kind of content that required going further than most people were willing to go and coming back with images nobody else had. Yellowstone in early winter was supposed to be the centerpiece of that plan. Empty trails, dramatic light, no crowds, no boot prints in the snow. I respect what she was building. Trading a stable career to go somewhere cold and empty and make something that was actually hers, I understand why a person does that. She had driven out alone in a car packed with camping gear and no fixed return date, staying in a rented cabin outside the park boundary and driving in each morning before the light changed.
She had found the access route on the satellite imagery while scouting for angles and the other photographers had not used.
It was a service road that cut the approach to a ridge she wanted by nearly an hour, and it did not appear on the maps handed out at the visitor center. She had used it twice before without any problem and had come to think of it as one of the small advantages she had built through research that most visitors never did. That morning, she was chasing signal as much as scenery. She had already hiked to 3 different points with her phone raised, watching the bars flicker and drop, wanting to post her location before the light shifted. A ridge ahead looked more promising. Getting to it meant crossing a snowbank that had built up over a hollow in the slope, the surface crusted and firm looking, giving nothing away about what had been happening underneath it through weeks of freeze and thaw. I have walked across snow that looked solid and felt it shift underneath me, and the instinct in that moment is always to keep moving forward rather than back. I think that instinct is exactly what happened here. Sorrel broke through the snow to her waist. She had gone straight through the roof of an occupied den. Black bears in Yellowstone enter torpor in late autumn, their heart rate and body temperature dropping significantly as they wait out the winter in dens that are often dug into slopes or hollows where snow accumulates naturally above them. The bear inside came out of torpor the way any animal does when something drops into its space without warning.
The attack that followed was fast and close range, and there was no distance between them to work with.
She sustained severe lacerations to her arms and upper body as she attempted to pull herself out of the opening, and the bear pushed upward through the collapsed snow toward her. She was above ground and moving when she broke free, but the injuries she had already sustained were serious and the temperature was dropping. She had not told anyone which route she was taking that morning. Her sister had called twice, heard voicemail both times, and told herself Sorrel was probably out of range chasing a sunset shot the way she often was. It was not until the following afternoon, nearly 18 hours after Sorrel's last post, that the silence felt different enough to call the park. Rangers used a geotag from her final photograph to narrow the search area. From there, they worked outward through the surrounding terrain and considered nearby access points, including the service road that was closed to visitors during winter. They found the collapsed snowbank before they found her. She had made it approximately 40 yards from the den before the combination of her injuries and the cold had stopped her. 40 yards. She made it 40 yards on her own after everything that had just happened to her. I think about the kind of will that takes, and it genuinely moves me. Sorrel Vane was found deceased. Investigators established that the den collapse had been accidental and that the bear had responded defensively to a sudden intrusion at close range. The animal was not located for removal. It was July 29th, 2019. Off the coast of Maine, the channel between the mainland and a small island was calm that morning. The water was 59 degrees Fahrenheit and the outgoing tide was running steadily southwest. Lyle Calabro was 43, a swim coach and former collegiate swimmer who had been doing open water swims in Maine for more than a decade. He had completed this channel crossing twice before and treated it as a personal benchmark each summer. I understand the appeal of traditions like that. The same route, the same distance, year after year. Before leaving home that morning, he told his wife where he was going. Unlike his first crossing, he had not arranged for a support kayaker. His phone remained locked in his car. In the water, he carried only a wetsuit, goggles, and a bright orange swim cap. He entered the water at 6:04 from a small public boat ramp and began the crossing. His pace was steady, the water was clear, and the island remained visible ahead of him. Nothing about the first 20 minutes suggested anything unusual. About 400 yards to the north, a lobsterman was checking traps when he noticed a sudden disturbance on the surface at around 6:26. He later described it as a brief eruption of white water that lasted only a few seconds before the channel went calm again. Unsure what he had seen, he returned to work. A few minutes later, something about it continued to bother him, and he turned the boat around to investigate.
In a lot of these stories, someone notices something unusual and shrugs it off. In this case, it's hard to say exactly when curiosity turned into concern.
Great white sharks are known to execute what researchers describe as high-speed lateral charges when targeting larger prey, approaching at nearly horizontal angles to maximize the force of the initial bite. Unlike the upward strike commonly used against seals, this attack geometry is associated with prey items that are at or near the surface level, such as open water swimmers. There was no warning before the strike. The great white shark came from Lyle's right side and slightly below, moving at full speed in a lateral charge with its body nearly horizontal at the moment of contact. The jaws closed on his right side from the lower rib cage to the upper hip. At the same instant, the animal's full momentum drove through him. The force fractured 4 ribs on the right side, collapsed the right lung, and snapped the thoracic spine at the level of the 8th and 9th vertebrae, severing the spinal cord at that level. The shark released on contact and did not return. The spinal injury left Lyle unable to move and quickly led to cardiovascular collapse. He was face down in the water almost immediately after the strike, kept afloat only by the buoyancy of his wetsuit. His orange swim cap remained in place. His goggles were knocked off by the impact and were never recovered. The lobsterman reached him at around 6:31. He looped a line under Lyle's arms and pulled him onto the deck of his vessel. There were no signs of life. He called for help on his marine radio at 6:33. A response vessel arrived at 7:01, 28 minutes after the call. A medical team examined Lyle on the lobsterman's vessel, and he was pronounced dead at 7:09. The post-mortem confirmed fractures of the right 6th through 9th ribs, complete collapse of the right lung, and fracture dislocation of the thoracic spine at the 8th and 9th vertebrae with full transection of the spinal cord. The coroner attributed death to neurogenic shock resulting from the spinal cord injury, with hemothorax as a contributing factor, and noted that loss of consciousness would have occurred within seconds of the strike and that the injury was not survivable under any circumstances. Lyle's car was at the boat ramp with his phone inside. His training notebook was in his bag on the back seat, open to that morning's entry. His wife reported him missing at 9:15 when he had not come home. She was notified of his death later that morning. The case was ruled an accidental death.
There is something unsettling about how ordinary his morning was. Right up until that moment, he was just checking traps when someone else's story suddenly became part of his.
It was May 18th, 2020 in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and the birthday party had been Renata's idea from the start. Renata Alvarez was 38 years old and ran a small lifestyle blog from home, and she lived on a small property outside the city with her daughter and an animal. Most people in her life had spent years telling her to give up. Years earlier, she had agreed to take in an orphan chimpanzee that had been separated from its mother under the understanding that the arrangement would be temporary. It never became temporary. The months stretched into years, and somewhere along the way, Renata stopped thinking of him as a wild animal she was housing and started thinking of him as family. In the early years, that feeling made a certain kind of sense. The chimp followed her around the house, played with toys, learned the daily routine, and depended on her for everything. She fed him, nursed him when he was sick, and spent more time with him than she did with most people. He sat at the dinner table, wore clothes, rode in the car, and greeted visitors without incident. Every year that passed without a serious problem made the warnings from friends and relatives easier to dismiss. An arrangement that was supposed to be temporary, turning into years of treating a wild primate like a member of the family. I understand how that happened slowly. I just cannot understand how what came next couldn't be stopped. By the time her daughter turned 7, bringing the chimp to the birthday party felt completely normal to her. He had been around noise and people before without incident, and she saw no reason to treat this differently. He arrived without a harness. The room was crowded and loud, the way children's parties always are. Kids ran between tables, adults talked over each other, music played from a speaker near the wall, and a clown moved through the room entertaining the guests. Renata circulated through the space, greeting family and helping organize the celebration, while the chimp stayed near her. Then she sounded an air horn to get the occasion started. The blast lasted less than a second. He bit into her right hand first, crushing several bones before releasing and lunging again. He seized her forearm and inflicted severe wounds as she tried to pull away. The movement appeared to escalate the attack. He struck her repeatedly, grabbed at her face and scalp, and continued biting and pulling with a strength few people in the room could comprehend. By the time several adults attempted to intervene, Renata had suffered extensive injuries to her hands, arms, face, and upper body. The lacerations were severe, and significant blood loss occurred within minutes. Panic moved through the room instantly. Parents grabbed children and ran. Several people locked themselves in upstairs bedrooms. Others pulled kids into bathrooms and barricaded the doors while calling emergency services from inside. First responders arrived within minutes and found Renata suffering from catastrophic traumatic injuries and severe blood loss. She was transported to a nearby hospital where doctors attempted emergency surgery and massive transfusion measures, but her condition continued to deteriorate. Renata died shortly afterward from complications of her injuries. I genuinely wonder how traumatized those children will be after that incident. Wildlife authorities secured the chimpanzee and investigated the incident. Officials concluded that years of human contact had not removed the instincts of a mature wild animal, and that the air horn had triggered a threat response the animal had no learned behavior to suppress. Because the chimpanzee had caused a fatal attack, it was euthanized. Renata was buried quietly with few friends in attendance. It was June 3rd, 2021 on a backcountry trail in Wyoming, and the morning had started the way good hiking days usually do. Zevrik Hollow was 46 years old and worked as an accountant at a firm in the city.
Free weekends were rare for him, and the ones that came around usually disappeared into errands and obligations.
His wife had traveled abroad for a week-long business meeting, and he decided the timing was right to spend a proper day outdoors with his 19-year-old son before the young man left for college later that year. They had hiked together before, and both of them enjoyed it. They wanted to spend one of their last weekends together before college separates them. I think about how many people would recognize that feeling without ever having lived through what came next. The night before the trip, they packed carefully. Water, food, bear spray, a first aid kit, and an emergency beacon all went into Zevrik's backpack, along with both of their phones and the car keys. He wanted everything important in one place. They drove into grizzly country early the next morning and started along a remote trail that followed a fishing creek through the forest. The hike began well. They talked and took photographs and stopped several times to look at the scenery. Nothing about the first stretch of trail felt unusual.
What they did not know was that a partially buried elk carcass was hidden in the tree close to the trail.
A grizzly had been feeding there and had not gone far. Grizzly bears are intensely protective of food sources and will charge anything they perceive as a threat to a carcass, often without extended warning. As the two of them rounded a bend in the trail, the bear came out of the trees at speed. There was almost no warning. The grizzly hit Zevrik before he could do anything and knocked him to the ground. His son pulled out the bear spray immediately and fired several bursts toward the animal. The spray reached the bear and it pulled back and retreated into the trees. The attack had lasted only seconds. Both of them were shaken, but on their feet and able to move. They started back toward the trailhead as quickly as they could. About half a mile down the trail, Zevrik stopped. His backpack was gone. It had come off during the attack and was still lying back near the carcass site. Inside it were both phones, the car keys, and the emergency beacon. Without the backpack, they had no way to drive home and no reliable way to call for help if anything else went wrong. I seriously can't help but wonder how his trip was as he went back to that place. Zevrik told his son to keep moving to the trailhead and wait there. His son argued and told him the bear was likely still close to the carcass. Zevrik believed the spray had pushed it far enough away and that he would be back quickly. He turned around and walked back alone. The bear had never left. It had returned to the elk carcass after the spray drove it off and was still there when Zevrik came back into the area. He would have seen the backpack on the ground near the carcass site and understood immediately that the animal was close. There was no second round of bear spray. He had given the canister to his son.
The bear charged from a short distance with no barrier between them.
It struck him across the upper body and drove him into the ground. Once he was down, the animal bit into the back of his skull and upper neck with enough force to cause immediate and catastrophic trauma. The attack was over quickly, but the damage was not survivable. Zevrik was found face down a short distance from where the backpack had fallen. His son waited at the trailhead for over 2 hours before a passing hiker noticed him standing alone and helped him contact park rangers. Rescue teams moved into the area immediately. They found the backpack where it had landed during the first attack. The grizzly was still nearby guarding the carcass. A short distance away, they found Zevrik. His son stood at that trailhead for 2 hours, not knowing. I cannot imagine what those 2 hours felt like. Zevrik Hollow died from injuries sustained during the second encounter. The coroner's report concluded that Zevrik Hollow died from catastrophic head and upper neck injuries sustained during a grizzly bear attack, with the injuries determined to be immediately fatal. The investigation concluded that the grizzly had been defending a partially buried elk carcass only a short distance from the trail. He was laid to rest by his son and wife.
It was August 10th, 2016, at a regional wildlife center in the southeastern United States during a late morning feeding in a big cat enclosure. The facility housed African lions managed under protected contact protocols, with feeding conducted. Tomas Juros was 44. He ran a small climate systems business and occasionally did support work for zoo facilities. He'd worked around controlled carnivore feeding setups before, mostly on the systems side rather than direct animal handling. He was helping with a scheduled feeding task that involved preparing and moving meat portions through a reinforced chute while the lions were secured in an indoor holding den. Standard procedure required full confirmation that all secondary barriers were locked before anyone got near the feeding interface. The male lion had a strong food response pattern. When feeding time got close, you could see the shift. More alert, more focused, a bit more agitated. Once prep started behind the barrier, he picked up on it immediately. Sound, scent, movement. He was locked onto all of it. He'd pace in short bursts, stop, then move again, staying close to the inner boundary. And every so often, he'd press up against the mesh in quick lunges, almost testing it, just fully tuned in to what was happening on the other side. During the transfer phase, a wheeled meat delivery cart became unstable after striking an uneven section of flooring near the entrance to the feeding race. The cart tipped over, spilling multiple prepared meat portions across the corridor and into the transfer route used for active feeding operations. The spill immediately triggered a halt in the feeding sequence. Standard protocol required suspension of active feeding operations and restriction of personnel access to the transfer race until the area could be cleared under secured conditions. The lion's attention intensified as the scent and visibility of scattered meat increased along the feeding interface. The animal paced more tightly along the enclosure boundary, tracking activity in the transfer race as cleanup efforts continued. As Thomas moved into position to assist with righting the cart and recovering spilled portions, he entered the same active feeding race where food remained scattered along the corridor. With that being said, I can kind of feel how quickly that transfer race tightens up the moment the spill happens, and everyone ends up in the same confined space. During ongoing recovery efforts, the lion gained access to the transfer race through an unsecured or partially engaged interface point during the disruption. The entry occurred rapidly, collapsing the separation between enclosure-side feeding behavior and the active transfer space. Thomas attempted to withdraw toward the service corridor, but the narrow layout of the feeding race and scattered equipment limited his movement. The lion closed the distance almost immediately, making contact at close range. Within the confined space, a bite was delivered to his upper body, and the animal maintained grip during the initial engagement, leaving little opportunity for effective escape or intervention. The encounter resulted in severe traumatic injuries, consistent with major soft tissue and vascular damage. The victim became rapidly unresponsive, with death attributed to hemorrhagic shock. Staff activated emergency containment procedures and remotely secured the enclosure, but access to the corridor remained delayed until the animal was fully contained. Thomas was pronounced dead at the scene. A post-incident investigation found that a delivery cart tip and resulting food spill during active feeding disrupted normal procedures. Investigators concluded that scattered food in the transfer race and continued personnel activity escalated animal focus and allowed rapid entry into the feeding interface zone. The facility revised protocols to require immediate suspension of feeding after any spill, full clearance of transfer areas before recovery, and stricter separation of personnel from active feeding zones.
March 14, 2016. A cool, still morning settled over Little Rock, Arkansas. Zoo staff were arriving for the early shift. The grounds were quiet before public hours, with animals eating and keepers moving through their opening routines. It was a morning no different from any of the thousands of mornings that had come before it at this facility. For 59 years old, Robert Harrison and the zoo's elephant manager, it was just another workday. Harrison was not a trainee. He was not someone still learning the job. He had been working at that zoo for over 25 years, spending the bulk of his career dedicated specifically to large animal care. His knowledge of elephant behavior was the kind that only comes from daily contact over many years. Colleagues respected him. His experience level was not in question by anyone at that facility. And one of the animals under his care for all those years was a 6,000-pound Asian elephant named Maya. Maya had been at the zoo since 1998. She had a history of aggressive incidents, and keepers were trained to work cautiously around her. Harrison knew her temperament better than anyone, but the zoo at that time was still operating under what is called a free contact management system, a model where keepers and elephants share the same physical space rather than always working from behind a protective barrier. By 2016, many facilities across the country had already moved away from this system because of the risks it carried. This zoo had not yet completed that transition.
I think this is where experience can become deceptive. The more routine something feels, the easier it is to believe tomorrow will be just like yesterday.
As part of the morning routine, Harrison, with two keepers, entered the shared enclosure with Maya while preparing or delivering her food. When I look at this case, this is the detail I keep coming back to. Harrison had spent years caring for Maya. He knew her routines, her temperament, and had worked with her countless times. But this case is a reminder that no matter how many years you've spent with a wild animal, precautions are still necessary. Experience builds knowledge, not immunity. When you're standing next to a 6,000-pound elephant, the margin for error is always small. Elephants are highly intelligent animals, but they can also be unpredictable, especially around food. Some develop a habit of guarding it and may react aggressively if they feel threatened or challenged. Experienced keepers are trained to watch for even the smallest changes in an elephant's behavior. But in Maya's case, witnesses said there was almost no warning. One moment she appeared calm, the next she charged.
Everything happened in just a few seconds. A 6,000-pound elephant can move faster than most people expect, and Harrison had almost no time to react.
Maya charged, striking him with her head and knocking him to the ground. Once he was down, the sheer weight of her body caused devastating injuries. By the time other keepers reached him, it was already too late. Harrison died from severe blunt force injuries to his chest and abdomen caused by the attack. The zoo remained open. The elephant exhibit was temporarily closed. The facility issued a statement, and Robert Harrison, a man who had given 25 years of his life to the care of animals at that zoo, was gone. What I understood from this case is that experience is not armor. It's not that Harrison lacked experience. It's that some risks can never be completely controlled. You can understand an animal better than anyone else, follow the routine you've followed for years, and still have one moment that changes everything. It was an October evening in 2022 in the hill country of Western Virginia, and the platform at the edge of the property had been there long enough that the wood had started to gray. Corvin Halley was 53 years old and worked remotely doing technical documentation for a software company. 11 years earlier, a divorce had left him wanting distance from people, and he had bought 40 acres backing onto National Forest with the nearest neighbor a quarter-mile off.
He kept to himself and spent the first couple of years on the property in solitude, telling himself it was the life he had always wanted.
The bear started showing up the way bears do, working the tree line in the evenings for whatever it could find. Corvin noticed himself looking forward to the sightings more than made sense. He was lonely in a way he did not talk about, and the bear had given his evenings something to organize around. Leaving out apple scraps was easy to justify at first. By the second summer, the scraps had turned into a routine, then hand feeding, and somewhere in there a story had built up around it, that the bear came back specifically for him, that it recognized his voice and his walk. It was easier to believe that than to believe it was simply showing up for apples. I think loneliness does something particular to the way people interpret animal behavior. It makes connection feel possible where the animal is not actually offering one. I do not say that unkindly. I just think it is true. The following started almost by accident. He posted a few phone videos mostly to have someone to show, and the response surprised him. People called it beautiful and called him brave. It was more warmth than he had received from anywhere else in years, and the platform he built, partly for better camera angles, became its own reason to keep going. Wildlife officials visited twice and said the same thing both times.
He was training a wild animal to associate human hands with food, and that association ends badly.
Corvin heard them both times and kept going anyway, quieter after the second visit, because by then the ritual was not really about the bear. It was the one part of his week that felt like it was working. I understand why he kept going after that second warning. When something is filling a space that nothing else is filling, you do not give it up because an official told you to. You find reasons to keep it. The evening Corvin ran out of apples. He walked to the platform on habit, already narrating to the camera the way he always did. American black bears are not domesticated, and the patterns that develop through through repeated food conditioning do not reflect genuine habituation to humans. What they reflect is a learned sequence. Approach, receive food, move on. When that sequence breaks, the animal escalates the behavior that has previously produced the reward, applying more force the way it would to a branch that has not given up its fruit.
The bear came up expecting the same open hand it had always found. The hand was empty.
It pushed into the space where the apple should have been, and the force behind it was not calibrated for a hand with nothing in it. Corvan stumbled backward off the edge of the platform. The bear followed the motion, came down on top of him with its front paws, and the impact fractured his collarbone and 2 ribs on his left side. The bear bit into his left shoulder, and the force tore through the muscle down to the bone. Corvan could not get his arm under him, and the animal was still above him when he stopped being able to call out. The camera kept the platform in frame for 6 more seconds after he stopped narrating. The bear's shoulder and head were still visible, working the space where his hand had been. A neighbor who followed the channel noticed the feed had gone silent mid-session and called for a welfare check the following morning. Responders found Corvan on the ground below the platform. He survived the initial injuries but died at the hospital 2 days later from complications related to the bite wound and internal bleeding. The bear was located and euthanized. Wildlife officials noted that the animal had done exactly what a food-conditioned bear does when the conditioning fails. It had simply kept doing the thing that had always worked before, with more force than the situation had ever previously required. The camera was still running when it happened. I have chosen not to describe it beyond what the investigation confirmed, because I think some things deserve to stay private. It was May 22nd, 2018. Along the southern Oregon coast, a quiet weekday morning settled over the narrow gravel beaches below the cliffs. The sky was overcast and the water temperature was 47 degrees Fahrenheit. Louis Prudhomme was 41, a high school biology teacher from Coos Bay who had taken up stand-up paddleboarding a few years earlier as a way to unwind before work. He wasn't a competitive athlete, but he had grown comfortable paddling this stretch of coastline and often went out alone. His phone was stored in a dry bag strapped to the board, protected but out of reach if he ended up in the water. He parked at a highway pullout just before 6 in the morning, carried his 12-foot inflatable board down the trail to the beach, and launched shortly after. He paddled south along the shoreline, staying within a couple hundred feet of the rocks at a relaxed pace. The coast was empty in both directions, with no other vessels on the water and no one on the beach behind him. Some people love that kind of solitude. On mornings like this, it can cut both ways. He had been out for about 40 minutes and covered close to 1.5 miles when something struck the underside of his board from below hard enough to knock him into the water. It was a blunt impact, not a bite. He surfaced immediately, grabbed the tail handle, and looked around. The water was dark and visibility was limited to just a few feet. Nothing was visible, and he wasn't hurt. Getting back on the board was the natural thing to do. He moved along the left rail, placed both hands on the edge, and began kicking to pull himself up. He had done it countless times before. He was halfway onto the board when the shark came back. Great white sharks frequently make initial contact with an unfamiliar object without biting, a behavior known as a spy hop or investigatory bump, before deciding whether to commit to a full attack. Researchers believe this behavior allows the animal to assess whether a potential prey item is worth pursuing. It came from below and to his left. The jaws closed over his left shoulder and chest, while both hands were still gripping the board. The force fractured multiple ribs and drove bone fragments into the lung beneath them. Blood and air began filling the chest cavity almost immediately. The shark held the bite for a couple of seconds before releasing and moving away. It did not return. Louis did not go under. He managed to get his right arm over the board and hold himself against it, half draped across the rail with his legs still in the water. His left arm was badly damaged and no longer responding. Unable to pull himself fully aboard but unwilling to let go, he remained there and drifted. His phone was 18 inches away in the dry bag on the deck. He could see it. He could not reach it without releasing his grip on the board, and he was not going to do that. But then, everything had become very simple. Hold on, don't let go, and hope someone comes along. The current carried him slowly north, back toward his launch point, over the course of the next 20 to 30 minutes. A man walking his dog along the beach noticed the board drifting close to the shoreline and waded out to pull it in. He found Louis draped over it and called for help immediately. Paramedics reached the beach at 8:19, 37 minutes after the call. The remote location slowed the response. Louis had no pulse when they arrived. Resuscitation efforts continued during transport, but he was pronounced dead at 9:05. The post-mortem found multiple rib fractures, a collapsed left lung, and severe chest trauma. The coroner determined that Louis died from respiratory failure caused by the injuries, with blood loss as a secondary factor. I keep thinking about how close he ended up to shore. Close enough for someone walking a dog to find him. It was October 13th, 2016, in Centralia, Washington, and the house looked completely normal from the outside when friends arrived the following morning. Kian Evander was 34 years old and had been fascinated by snakes since he was a child. While other kids collected sports cards or spent their allowance on video games, Kian spent his reading about reptiles and watching every documentary he could find about large constrictors. The interest never faded. As an adult with a steady income, he finally had the means to act on it. Through private contacts, he obtained a young reticulated python. Despite warnings from people around him and local regulations that restricted ownership of animals that size, Kian dismissed all of it. He believed that dedication and hands-on experience were enough to manage any animal safely, regardless of what it was. A childhood fascination that never got interrupted by an adult who said no. I think about how rare that actually is and how much it shaped everything that came after. Over the following decade, the python became the center of his life, outside of work. He spent thousands of dollars on its care and built dedicated spaces for it inside his home. Friends who visited were rarely comfortable around it, but Kian always responded the same way, telling them the animal was calm and that he knew its behavior better than anyone else. Unlike most keepers of large constrictors, he allowed the python to move freely through parts of the house while he was home. He found it relaxing to watch it explore the rooms. To him, it was no different from a dog or cat wandering the house in the evening. By the time the python reached adulthood, it measured just over 20 feet in length. Experts had told him more than once that an animal that size could not be safely managed alone. Kian always told them he had raised it from a juvenile, and that trust had been built over years. He continued handling it regularly and continued letting it move freely through the house without a second handler present. One evening, after spending time with the snake, Kian settled into his bedroom while the python was still loose in the house. Then, while he was already asleep, the snake coiled around him before he was fully alert enough to respond to it. Once a reticulated python of that size establishes multiple loops around a person's torso, the situation changes completely. Each time the person exhales, the coils tighten slightly to fill the space. Then his chest cavity lost its ability to expand fully on the next inhale. Breathing became shallow and then labored and then stopped producing enough oxygen to maintain consciousness. A person alone in that situation cannot generate the force needed to remove even a single established coil, let alone multiple loops from an animal weighing well over 150 pounds. Kian lost consciousness. The following day, friends who had been calling his phone without an answer went to the house to check on him. They found him unresponsive in his bedroom with the python still present. Emergency services were contacted immediately, but there was nothing to be done. Kian Evander was pronounced dead at the scene. He was asleep when it happened. That detail makes this one feels different from almost every other case I have covered. Investigators examined the room and reviewed what they could piece together from the physical evidence. They found no indication that the python had attempted to consume him. The death was ruled accidental constriction involving a large snake that had been allowed unsupervised access to the living space. Trained animal control personnel removed the python from the property afterward. Kian had spent a decade building what he believed was a relationship with the animal. He had fed it, cared for it, and handled it more times than he could count. None of that changed what the snake was or what it was capable of on an evening when no one else was there. It was August 6th, 2022, in a national park in Montana, and the trail crew had been working since early morning. Elowen Vale was 26 years old and had spent the better part of the previous year building a clothing brand from the ground up. The launch had gone well, but the months leading up to it had been relentless, and by summer she was running on empty in a way that rest at home was not going to fix. For her birthday, she decided on something different. She signed up to join a conservation volunteer crew in a national park for a few days, hoping that physical work in open country would do what staying home could not. Choosing physical work in the wilderness over a birthday celebration at home. I think most people reading this would not have made that choice. I find something admirable about that. Before the project began, every volunteer attended a mandatory safety briefing run by park staff.
They covered a wildlife behavior in detail with a specific focus on grizzly bears.
Volunteers were told to stay together, move calmly, never run under any circumstances, and follow the group leaders if an encounter happened. The reason running was dangerous was explained clearly. Grizzly bears have a deeply wired chase response, and movement away from them can trigger a pursuit that would not otherwise occur. The group practiced the procedures, talked through real scenarios, and left the briefing with a solid understanding of what to do. Elowen had paid attention. On the second day, the 6-person crew was clearing fallen trees from a remote section of trail. The work had been going smoothly. Dense brush pressed in on both sides of the path, and visibility into the vegetation was limited to a few feet in either direction. Dense brush pressed in on both sides of the path, and visibility into the vegetation was limited to a few feet in either direction. A grizzly sow was resting in that brush with her 2 cubs. Mother grizzlies with cubs.
Mother grizzlies with cubs are among the most dangerous wildlife encounters in North America.
A sow protecting cubs does not issue extended warnings. When she perceives a sudden threat at close range, the response is immediate, and the speed of a charging grizzly over a short distance can reach 35 miles per hour, faster than any person can run. As the crew dragged a large fallen branch off the trail, they disturbed the brush where the family was resting. The sow came out without warning. No huffing, no jaw popping, no bluff charge. She moved directly toward the group from close range, and the volunteers had almost no time to process what was happening before she was already on them. Everything they had learned in the briefing dissolved in the shock of the moment. Most of the crew froze. They reacted exactly how all of us will do. I think that is what people do not understand about these situations. You can know exactly what to do and still not do it. Others began backing away slowly. Elowen turned and ran. The sow locked onto her immediately. A running person activates the same instinct in a bear that running prey does, and the rest of the crew disappeared from the bear's focus the moment Elowen moved. The chase covered the distance between them in seconds. The sow hit her from behind and drove her to the ground, biting into her upper back and neck with the full force of a defensive attack. The assault lasted only moments, but caused catastrophic injuries to her spine and the back of her skull. She did not get up. The crew leaders called for emergency assistance immediately, while the rest of the volunteers stayed as still as they could. Park rangers reached the area as fast as the terrain allowed.
They found Elowen on the trail with injuries that were not survivable.
Elowen Vale died from injuries sustained during the attack. Investigators concluded that the sow had been defending her cubs after being surprised at close range, and that the attack had been a defensive response rather than predatory behavior. The volunteers had received correct and thorough safety training before entering the backcountry. She had sat in that briefing and listened carefully. That is not nothing. I think about what the rest of that crew carried home with them after watching it happen. The volunteers were in shock after what happened, and none of them returned to that park.
It was March 4th, 2014, at a regional wildlife park in the northwestern United States during early morning operations in the carnivore wing. Behind Exhibit 7N, a service corridor beside the snow leopard habitat became the site of a fatal containment failure. Dara Messel was 29. She grew up in Grants Pass, Oregon, a working-class logging town. Nothing fancy, just a tough, practical place. She studied wildlife biology at a public state university, then moved into zoo work pretty quickly after that, eventually ending up with the big carnivores at a mid-sized wildlife facility. People inside usually described her the same way: careful, steady, almost strict about following procedure. The kind of person who actually sticks to every rule and checklist. No incidents, no write-ups, no safety issues. Just consistent work, day in and day out. And honestly, in that kind of work, that trait usually gets treated like a strength right up until something goes wrong anyway. The enclosure had been partially redesigned the year before, adding angled safety glass along a narrow staff-side corridor. In certain morning light, especially with a bit of condensation, it could create glare and soft distortion that slightly blurred sightlines in a few sections. The resident female snow leopard showed normal territorial behavior, often staying near the far boundary of the enclosure. Overnight, a minor ventilation issue led to condensation forming on parts of the glass, reducing visibility in a small section of the corridor during early morning hours. A supervisor's arrival was delayed that morning due to a logistical issue, so routine checks in the carnivore wing were briefly paused. One keeper did a limited external observation round while waiting for clearance, following restricted access protocol during partial staffing. A secondary service panel, adjusted during earlier enrichment work, hadn't been fully secured after maintenance. It looked closed, but the latch didn't actually hold under pressure, creating an unintended connection into a narrow maintenance junction. And that's the part that tends to matter most in hindsight for me. It didn't look unsecured. While moving through the corridor for visual confirmation, Dara entered a narrow junction where sightlines were partially obstructed by angled glass and condensation. The snow leopard closed the distance almost immediately after entering the junction, making contact at close range before Dara had an opportunity to retreat. The animal seized the upper shoulder and neck region while driving forward through the confined corridor. The force of the encounter knocked her off balance and into the concrete wall beside the passage. In the restricted space, the attack continued briefly before the animal disengaged and moved deeper into the junction. Dara sustained severe bite wounds to the head, neck, and upper torso, along with extensive lacerations to the arms incurred while attempting to protect herself. She remained critically injured and unable to summon assistance. Staff response began after a delayed morning check revealed communication irregularities and an unsecured corridor entry point. Access was restricted pending animal containment confirmation, and emergency personnel arrived shortly after, but resuscitation was not possible due to the severity of injuries. Medical findings identified fatal blood loss associated with extensive neck and upper body trauma. Additional injuries included facial fractures, extensive soft tissue damage to the head and neck, and blunt force injuries consistent with secondary impact against the corridor wall. Investigators concluded that survival would have depended on immediate intervention, which was not possible due to containment requirements. A joint investigation identified a failed secondary panel latch as the primary containment breach. Contributing factors included incomplete post-maintenance verification procedures and delayed identification of the unsecured access point. The facility revised inspection protocols for all modified service panels and reinforced multi-point containment checks. The animal remained in managed care.
It was October 19th, 2013. 12 miles off the coast of Gloucester, Massachusetts, a dense fog bank sat over the water. Swells were running 3 to 4 feet, and visibility was less than 100 feet. Greg Halverson was 47, a mechanical engineer from Boston with more than a decade of wreck diving experience in New England waters. He had organized the trip and had a habit of entering first and exiting last. The 3 divers with him had far less experience in cold water wreck environment. Their boat was a 32-foot fiberglass vessel operated by a friend who had made the run before. The wreck sat in 54 feet of water, and the dive itself went smoothly. After 38 minutes on the bottom, the group began their ascent. What they didn't know was that the boat's engine had died while they were underwater. The captain had tried to adjust for drift when the engine sputtered and quit. It's the kind of problem that sounds inconvenient until you see what happened next. By the time the first diver surfaced, the boat had already drifted about 60 feet from the descent line. The captain told everyone to swim over. The fog had thickened while they were below, and the boat was barely visible from the water.
If you've never been out in heavy fog, it's hard to appreciate how quickly you can lose sight of, well, your surroundings.
The first 3 divers reached the ladder and climbed aboard without trouble. Greg surfaced last about 40 feet away and started swimming toward the boat. He was halfway there when the captain spotted a large dark shape moving just beneath the surface and shouted a warning. Great white sharks in New England waters have increased significantly in number since the passage of the Marine Mammal Protection Act in 1972, which allowed gray seal populations along Cape Cod to recover and expand. At the time of this incident, great whites in the western North Atlantic were estimated to be capable of reaching speeds of up to 25 miles per hour in short bursts during an attack. Greg reached the ladder at 11:14. He had both hands on the lower rung and one fin on the bottom step when the great white shark struck from below. The bite closed over both legs and hit with enough force to bend the ladder and partially tear it away from the transom. Greg's grip broke and the shark pulled him under. Think about how close he was. He had already reached the ladder. His dry suit briefly slowed the descent as trapped air resisted being pulled underwater, but it made no difference. Both femoral arteries had been severed and both femurs fractured in the same bite. Greg went under at 11:14 and never resurfaced.
The 3 divers on the deck watched it happen from the stern. The captain fired a flare into the water near the last position out of reflex and then reached for the radio.
A response vessel arrived at 12:02, 45 minutes after the distress call. The fog forced rescuers to travel at reduced speed the entire way. The surviving divers and captain were transferred aboard. Greg's lower body was found about 18 feet beneath the boat, held in place by trapped air inside the dry suit. His upper body was recovered the following morning, roughly 30 feet away. Investigators believe the great white shark had likely returned after the initial attack, though that conclusion was based on physical evidence rather than direct observation. The post-mortem examination documented complete amputation of both legs at the mid-thigh, with both femoral arteries fully severed. The coroner determined that Greg died from hemorrhagic shock, with drowning as a secondary factor. His dive computer showed he had surfaced at 11:09, just 5 minutes before the attack. The engine failure was later traced to a fuel pump that had been malfunctioning for weeks. It's hard to look at a stalled engine the same way after reading a story like this. Its failure didn't cause the attack, but it changed the situation in ways nobody expected. It was October 15th, 2019, in western Montana, and the mountains looked very serene and beautiful. Colvern Jensen was 54 years old and had spent nearly 2 decades working as a heavy equipment mechanic in the United Arab Emirates. He had left Montana in his mid-30s for a contract that paid well enough to justify the distance, and had stayed because the money kept being worth it and because his family needed the stability. He worked long shifts maintaining construction machinery in a climate that was nothing like home, and spent years telling himself he would get back to the mountains eventually. When he finally returned for good, he knew exactly what he wanted to do first. He had been hunting elk with his father since he was a boy, and those trips had stayed with him through every year he spent abroad, as a specific kind of memory that does not soften with time. Nearly 2 decades away, and the thing he came home to first was hunting with his father's memory still in it. I find something genuinely moving about that kind of loyalty to a place and a time. That fall was the first hunting season he had been home for in nearly 2 decades. He went out alone on the morning of October 15th, and by mid-morning he had successfully harvested an elk on a timbered slope several miles from the trailhead.
The animal was too large to pack out without help, and he covered the carcass with branches.
Marked his location, and hiked back out, planning to return later with someone who could assist with the pack out. He had done similar things before and did not think much about leaving it. What he did not know was that a grizzly bear had found the elk in the hours he was gone. Grizzly bears are opportunistic feeders and will claim a carcass quickly once they locate it. Colvin came back to the site alone. He was moving through the timber toward the spot where he had left the elk when the bear came out of the thick brush at close range.
It had been bedded near the carcass, and Colvin had not seen it or heard it before he charged.
He had bear spray on his belt and got his hand to it, but the distance between them was too short for the spray to build an effective cloud before the bear reached him. The spray was on his belt, in the right place. He did everything the way you are supposed to, and the distance was still too short. I think about that a lot when people say just carry bear spray like it solves everything. The animal hit him across the upper left side of his body and drove him into the ground. It bit into the back of his neck and upper shoulder with enough force to fracture his left clavicle and tear through the muscle and tissue along the back of his neck. He managed to deploy the spray from the ground at near contact range, and the bear broke off and moved back toward the carcass. Colvin was conscious and got himself upright, but the neck and shoulder injuries were severe and he was losing blood. He had service on his phone at that elevation and called for help before he started moving. Search and rescue teams reached him on the slope approximately 2 hours after the call came in. He had remained near the site rather than attempting to hike out, and that decision likely extended the time available to treat him. He was airlifted to a regional trauma center where surgeons worked on the neck injury through the night. He survived the surgery but died 3 days later from complications related to the spinal damage caused by the bite. Investigators recovered the elk carcass and confirmed through tracks and other evidence that a grizzly had been feeding on it before the attack. Wildlife officials determined the bear had been acting in defense of a food source.
It was located and euthanized, given the severity of the contact.
He called for help before he started moving. He stayed put. He did everything right after the attack, and he still did not make it. That is the part of this case I genuinely struggle with. It was April 24, 2017 in northern Idaho, and the property was quiet in a way that felt wrong by the time anyone thought to check on her. Azura Magda was 42 years old. She owned a small bakery in town that she had been running for several years and had spent the last several years rebuilding a life that a difficult divorce had pulled apart. Her marriage of 10 years had ended badly, and the aftermath was the kind of quiet that gets heavier the longer it sits. The empty house, the evenings with nothing in them, the feeling that a version of her life had simply disappeared. She stayed close to her daughter and kept herself busy, but the loneliness was real, and she carried it for a long time before she found something that helped. That something was the wolves. It started with one animal and grew from there. Over the years, she built a large enclosure on her property and eventually owned 9 of them. Caring for them became the structure her days were built around. She fed them every morning, cleaned the enclosure, photographed them constantly, and spent hours inside the space with them. I think about what it means to feel a loneliness that deep with 9 animals that can never be domesticated. I understand why she did it. I just wish someone closer to her had understood it too. Her daughter and her former husband had both expressed concern over the years as the animals grew larger and more confident. Visitors to the property sometimes became uncomfortable when several of the animals gathered near the fencing at once. Azura dismissed it every time. The wolf obeyed her commands and followed her around the property without aggression. She had years of ordinary days behind her, and she used them as her evidence. On the morning of April 24th, she was supposed to meet her daughter later that day. She never arrived.
Nobody was immediately repeatedly alarmed because Azura often lost track of time while looking around the property.
As the hours passed and calls went unanswered, her former husband drove out to check on her. When he arrived, the wolves were visible, moving along the fencing in a way that did not look normal. Azura's vehicle was parked where it always was. Her phone was inside the house. She was not. Azura had entered the enclosure alone that morning, something she had done hundreds of times before. At some point, the dynamic inside the pack shifted.
One wolf became agitated, and the arousal spread through the group,
the way it does in pack predators when one member escalates. In the wild, wolves communicate across long distances and usually avoid humans. However, in confined spaces such as pens, backyards, or rooms, a wolf that feels threatened, stressed, or overly excited has no easy way to retreat, which can increase its stress levels and make aggressive behavior more likely. She attempted to calm them, but the behavior continued to intensify. The animal closest to her lunged and made contact with her upper body, pulling her off balance. Once she was on the ground, the pack closed in. She sustained severe bite wounds across her arms, shoulders, and neck, and could not get back to her feet before a second animal pulled her further into the enclosure by her leg. She did not get up again. Her former husband found her near the far end of the enclosure. The animals were still present. What he found made clear that she had been there for several hours. Emergency services were called immediately, but there was nothing to be done. Azura Magda was pronounced dead at the scene.
9 animals she fed every single morning for years. I keep sitting with the fact that none of that history mattered once the pack dynamic shifted against her.
Authorities secured the animals and transported them to a specialist facility. The investigation confirmed she had entered the enclosure alone and that the attack had involved multiple animals acting together. Azura had given those animals years of her life, but got nothing in return. It was 18th August 2017 in a remote park in south central Alaska. The mountains were clear and the weather was good as hikers moved through the remote backcountry trails. Rylan Alfredo was 36 years old and worked as a certified wilderness guide in Alaska. He had spent nearly 10 years leading hikers through remote backcountry trails and was known for staying calm under pressure. He had guided the same route more than 40 times and took pride in bringing every client home safely. At home in Juneau, his wife and their 4-month-old daughter were waiting for him.
You need to pause and hold on to this detail because what comes next relies heavily on it.
In August 2017, a newly married couple booked one of his multi-day backcountry hiking trips. Instead of spending their honeymoon at a beach resort, they wanted an adventure they would remember for the rest of their lives. They both loved nature and believed Alaska was the perfect place to begin their marriage. The couple seemed excited and well prepared for the journey ahead. The first day went exactly as planned. They saw eagles, moose, and even a coastal brown bear feeding in the distance along a river. Rylan kept the group far enough away to watch safely before leading them back toward camp. The couple took photographs and felt lucky to see so much wildlife without danger. The following morning, they continued along the trail. Everything was quiet until Rylan suddenly stopped walking. A coastal brown bear stood directly ahead. This time, the bear was not simply passing through. A partially eaten salmon carcass lay nearby. Rylan immediately understood the danger. Coastal brown bears are the largest bears in North America and can weigh up to 1,500 pounds. They become extremely defensive when protecting food sources.
A surprised bear protecting a food carcass will charge with little warning at speed exceeding 30 miles per hour.
Without raising his voice, Rylan told the couple to stay together and slowly back away. He stepped forward, placing himself between the bear and his clients. The group began following the standard retreat procedure, moving backwards slowly while avoiding sudden movements. For a few seconds, it seemed to be working. The bear watched them but did not advance. Then the bear charged without warning. Rylan knew the couple would not have enough time to escape if the bear focused on all 3 of them. Without hesitation, he deliberately drew the animal's attention toward himself. Before I continue, I want to make one thing clear. You need to know when to save your own life, especially when a lot depends on you. He shouted and made himself appear larger, holding his position between the bear and his clients. The massive animal accelerated toward him, with force covering the distance in seconds.
Rylan braced himself, but the impact was devastating.
The bear's full weight slammed into him, throwing his body backward hard onto the ground. His head struck a rock, blood soaked into the dirt. He screamed, but the sound was cut short as the bear's jaws closed on his throat. His body went still beneath the bear's weight. The couple continued retreating until they were safely beyond the danger and eventually reached base camp, where they reported what had happened. Search teams began looking for Rylan immediately. They found signs of the encounter, but he did not survive. The coroner's report determined that Rylan Alfredo sustained catastrophic neck injuries, skull fractures, and massive soft tissue trauma during a coastal brown bear attack. Investigators later concluded that Rylan Alfredo died while protecting his clients during a defensive bear attack near the salmon carcass. The couple returned home alive because their guide chose to stay behind. His wife learned that her husband had died doing exactly what he believed was right. She returned to Juneau with their 4-month-old daughter and no one to bring her to the mountains as he had promised.
Imagine waking up every day to remember your husband lost his life to protect another home. I don't even have the answer to that.
It was August 7th, 2014, south of Santa Cruz, California. The morning started with a clean 4 to 6 foot swell and a sky just beginning to brighten. The water was 62 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind was light, and only a few surfers were out before sunrise. Scattered along the reef, Kayla Farrell was 24 and had been surfing since she was a child. She was a regular at this break, known for her focus and for putting in extra hours before school or contest. That morning, she drove herself to the beach, texted her mom to check in, and paddled out just after 6:30. There were 2 other surfers in the water, both adults, sitting farther down the reef. Kayla's plan was to work on her backhand, hoping to sharpen her turns before the next regional event.
I've always thought surfers have a different relationship with the ocean than most people. A lot of them know their local break the way other people know their neighborhood.
By 7, she was sitting on her board in the inside section, waiting for a set. The water was clear enough to see the reef below. One of the other surfers noticed a large shadow pass beneath him, moving quickly toward the inside, but he kept it to himself, thinking it was just a big fish.
To be fair, surfers see shadows all the time. Most of them turn out to be exactly what they look like. Nothing.
The first wave of the set arrived larger than expected and broke earlier than usual. Kayla turned to paddle over it, but was caught inside. She duck dived under the foam, surfaced on the backside, and immediately started paddling hard to get outside before the next wave. She was still prone on her board, arms digging, when the water beneath her shifted. Great white sharks are responsible for the majority of unprovoked fatal shark attacks on surfers worldwide. And researchers believe many of these involve a case of mistaken identity. A surfer on a board, viewed from below, closely resembles a sea lion or seal in silhouette. There was no warning. The great white shark came from below and to her left, its jaws closing over the left side of her board and her left thigh in a single bite. The force lifted her partially out of the water and twisted the board violently. Her femur broke and the femoral artery was cut. The shark rolled once, then released and disappeared into deeper water. Kayla surfaced, still attached to her board by the leash, on her back, her left leg trailing in the water. The water around her darkened quickly. She was conscious but unable to call out. One of the other surfers saw her struggling and paddled over, reaching her within about 90 seconds. He pulled her onto his board, keeping her head above water, and started paddling for shore. It's easy to focus on the attack itself, but those 2 surfers deserve a lot of credit for what happened next. The second surfer followed close behind, helping to steady the boards as they moved through the whitewater. They reached the sand at 7:16. Kayla was still breathing but unresponsive. One of the surfers used his leash as a tourniquet, wrapping it around her upper thigh and twisting it tight with a piece of driftwood. It slowed the bleeding but could not stop it. Emergency services were called at 7:13 while they were still paddling in. Paramedics arrived at 7:31. Kayla lost consciousness before they reached her and was pronounced dead at the hospital later that morning. The coroner's report described a deep bite wound to the upper left thigh with complete transection of the femoral artery and a mid-shaft femur fracture. The blood loss was rapid and severe, and the report noted that even with immediate intervention, survival would have been unlikely. The surfboard showed a crescent-shaped bite on the left rail, with tooth marks matching a great white shark estimated at 10 to 13 feet in length. Kayla's wetsuit, leash, and the improvised tourniquet were collected as evidence.
Maybe it's because I grew up around surfers, but stories like this always feels different to me. The ocean is a part of their routine right up until something happens that, well, no amount of experience can prepare you for.
It was September 14th, 2015 in Houston, Texas, and the property was quiet when emergency responders arrived. Estela Moro was 27 years old and lived on the edge of the city. She had started posting videos a few years earlier to almost no response. Hundreds of views on a good day. Nothing that suggested anything was coming. Then she bought a tiger cub and everything shifted. People could not get enough of it.
The cub chased toys across her floors, climbed her furniture, and followed her from room to room like a dog that had not yet learned its size.
Her audience grew fast and then faster. Sponsorship offers arrived. Ad revenue climbed every month. Within a year, filming was no longer something she did on the side. It was how she paid for everything. The math behind that decision haunts me. The animal that brought in the income was also the only thing that could end everything. The tiger was not just a pet. It was the reason the light stayed on. Estela's tiger kept growing, and the dynamic between them shifted with it. Feeding time became something she approached more carefully as the months passed.
When raw meat was present, the animal became intensely focused in a way that made her cautious.
It would position itself between her and the food and hold that position until it finished eating. There were low warning sounds on certain days. A swat here and there that left bruises she did not film. She laughed most of it off publicly, and her audience laughed with her. Then her dog died while she was out one afternoon. She never told her audience what she believed had happened. She simply said the dog had died unexpectedly and moved on. But when she came home and found it, she could not think of another explanation. For a while, she considered giving the tiger away. Then she looked at her numbers, her sponsorships, her monthly revenue, and she kept filming. She had a moment right there where she could have walked away. The numbers won that argument. I think about how many of these stories come down to exactly that calculation. Years passed that way.
One afternoon, she decided to film something that reminded people of the early days.
The videos where she was right beside the animal, close enough to touch it, showing everyone how much it trusted her. Those videos always performed well, and she knew it. The camera was already recording when she stepped into the tiger's enclosure on her property. At first, everything appeared normal. The tiger approached the way it usually did, and Estela moved toward it and reached out. Then the animal's behavior changed in an instant. A tiger raised by a human from birth still carries the full behavioral and physiological profile of a wild apex predator.
The animal struck her with its front paws and brought her to the ground.
The force of the initial impact alone was enough to cause serious injury. What followed lasted only moments, but the damage was catastrophic. The tiger's jaws closed around the back of her neck and upper shoulder region with a bite force and caused immediate and severe trauma to the structures of her neck and upper spine. Estela lost consciousness within seconds and did not recover. The camera recorded for a short time before the footage ended. Emergency responders were called, but her injuries were not survivable. Estela Moro was pronounced dead at the scene. Investigators reviewed the footage and examined the property. They found no fault with any external party. Estela had purchased the tiger legally under a private ownership arrangement and had housed it in a specially modified enclosure on her property. Estela had raised the tiger from a cub and spent years believing that the bond they had built meant something the animal could choose to honor. Tigers do not make that calculation. It was 26th February 2020 on a remote fire access road in northern Idaho, and the temperature had been sitting below zero for most of the week. Ravna Sol was 31 years old and worked as a financial analyst at a mid-sized firm in Boise. She had started working in her teens to fund her own way through school and had spent the years since climbing steadily through the firm until a promotion had come through the previous month. It was the kind of thing she had been working toward for a long time, and she had decided to celebrate it by going somewhere remote and spending a few days alone in the kind of quiet that her working life did not leave much room for.
She had taken winter backcountry trips before, was comfortable in the terrain. She packed her truck and drove north.
A promotion she had worked years toward, and the way she chose to celebrate it was to go somewhere completely alone and quiet. I think that says something real about who she was. Her boyfriend worked nights at a hotel near their apartment, and they kept different schedules that meant a full day could pass without either of them registering the other's silence. She had mentioned the general area she was heading to before she left, and said she might lose signal for stretches. He had not thought much of it because that was how her solo trips always went. She had been out for 2 days when she found the kill site. An animal had gone down recently, within the last day or two based on the condition of the carcass, and the snow around it had been heavily disturbed by something large. The track pattern around the site was unmistakable, even to someone without formal wildlife training. A grizzly had been feeding there and had cached the remains under a shallow covering of snow and debris, the way grizzlies do when they intend to return.
She stood at a distance and looked at it for a while, and then made a decision she could not take back.
She moved closer to get a better look. Grizzly bears that cache food are not simply storing it. They defend it actively and monitor the site from nearby cover. The bear had been bedded in dense pine cover 30 yards from the carcass. I think most people standing at that distance, looking at a carcass in the snow, would feel the same pull she did. Curiosity is not recklessness. It just became that in this specific moment. It came out of the tree line at a full run before she had time to back away from her closer position. She had bear spray in her jacket pocket rather than on her belt, and by the time she got it out, the bear had already covered most of the ground between them. The first strike knocked her backward into the snow. The bear bit into her right forearm as she brought it up, and the force snapped both bones in her lower arm. She got the spray discharged at close range, and the bear broke off and moved back toward the cache before disappearing into the tree line. She was alone, half a mile from the truck, with a broken arm and chest injuries that made breathing difficult. She made it back to the road, but not to the truck. Her boyfriend did not register anything wrong until the following afternoon when a friend asked if she had made it back yet. He remembered her mentioning the area before she left.
When he contacted the search team, what little he recalled was enough to narrow the starting point.
They found the truck on the fire access road by early evening. They found her a short distance away. She had died from a combination of the injuries sustained during the attack and exposure during the time it had taken her to reach the road. She made it back to the road. On a broken arm and chest injuries in below zero temperatures, she made it back to the road. And it still was not far enough. That is what follows me most about this case. The cache site was located during the investigation, and the bear was identified through tracks. Wildlife officials determined it had been defending a food source, and the animal was not removed. It was May 24th, 2019, in Montana, and the creek had been quiet for hours before the brush moved. Cabane Carter was 31 years old and had spent 2 years building an outdoor reaction channel with a following that had grown steadily because of one thing: he never faked anything. His viewers came back because the fear on his face was real, the hesitation was real, and the situations he put himself in were real. He had started with harmless outdoor content before gradually moving toward wildlife encounters, and the closer he got, the more the numbers grew. He had already survived 2 close calls before Montana. In Africa, he had filmed himself reacting to a lion from what he believed was a safe distance before the animal began moving toward him, and local guides intervened. A few months later, he had crept too close to a large crocodile for a better camera angle and had to scramble backward when it lunged toward the shoreline.
Both times he walked away, and both times he came away with the same conclusion.
He understood dangerous animals better than most people gave him credit for. 2 close calls that both ended fine. I have read enough of these cases to know that surviving something twice does not make the third time safer. But what happens next might prove us wrong. That belief brought him to Montana. He spent weeks researching locations where grizzly bears were regularly seen during fishing season, and eventually chose a remote area in the mountains known for frequent activity near creek beds. He drove nearly 4 hours into the wilderness on the morning of May 24th and hiked toward a stretch of creek where fresh bear tracks had been reported. When he found more tracks near the water, he set his tripod up facing the tree line, pointed the camera at his own position, and began recording. He wanted his genuine reaction the moment a bear appeared. He kept his bear spray secured in its holster on his hip rather than in his hand because he expected the animal to emerge much further away and did not want the canister visible in the shot.
Because it was the peak of the fishing season, bears regularly use the creek to feed on spawning fish.
Cabane had unknowingly set up near one of the bear's normal feeding routes. When the grizzly emerged from the brush and saw him at close range, it continued toward him instead of turning away. For several minutes, nothing moved. Then the brush at the tree line shifted and a large grizzly stepped out, approximately 30 feet away. Cabane froze the moment he saw it. The bear locked onto him and began moving forward without hesitation. 30 feet? I keep trying to picture that distance and what those first seconds must have felt like standing there with the camera still running behind him. He reached for the bear spray, but the holster clip did not release cleanly and several seconds passed while he worked it open. The bear was already closing the distance when he finally raised the canister and discharged it. Grizzly bears can cover 30 feet in under 2 seconds when they charge. The spray reached the animal at the edge of the cloud, but the bear had already covered most of the ground between them, and the concentration at that range was not enough to stop the charge fully. The bear made contact before the deterrent could take effect. It struck him across the upper chest and shoulder with one paw, and the force alone dropped him to the ground. Once he was down, the animal bit into the back of his neck and upper back with enough force to fracture vertebrae and cause immediate and severe spinal trauma. The attack lasted less than 30 seconds.
When it was over, Cabane was face down near the creek bank and could not move.
Cabane never made it back to his vehicle. When his family could not reach him, they reported him missing, and search teams entered the area the following day. They found him near the creek. The bear spray canister was still in his hand. His camera was lying a short distance away where it had fallen. Cabane Carter died from injuries sustained during the encounter. The coroner's report stated that Cabane Carter suffered fatal cervical spine fractures and severe neck trauma during a grizzly bear attack, resulting in rapid death at the scene. Investigators recovered the camera and the memory card had survived. The footage was retained as evidence before being returned to the family. His brother posted the final video himself. He asked viewers not to risk their lives for content. I think about what it must have taken to sit down and record that. It was July 14th, 2017. Catalina Island sits about 22 miles off the coast of Los Angeles. That afternoon, the water was calm and blue-green, and a yacht sat anchored about 3 miles off the island's sheltered side. Phil Del Vecchio was 41, a confident contractor from San Diego. Elena Kaspar was 36, an athletic graphic designer from Pasadena. Kurt Farrell was 39, Phil's longtime friend and the least experienced swimmer in the group. Gwyneth Halverson was 34, Elena's co-worker and a first-time open ocean swimmer. By 2:30, all four were in the water off the stern platform. They stayed within about 30 feet of the yacht, swimming casually. The water was clear, with nothing visible beneath them. A deckhand on the stern spotted a dark shape moving under the surface about 50 feet off the port side. It disappeared before he got a good look. After a minute or two, he dismissed it and went back to lunch. It's easy to judge that decision afterward. In the moment, a dark shape in the water probably didn't seem worth sounding an alarm over. Great white sharks are the largest predatory fish on Earth, capable of reaching lengths of 20 feet and weights exceeding 5,000 pounds. At 2:51, the shark surged upward into the swim platform from below. The impact cracked the fiberglass and partially collapsed it inward, sending a shockwave through the water that scattered them away from the boat. Kurt reached the platform first. He grabbed the broken edge and pulled himself up, tearing a deep gash along his left forearm on the cracked fiberglass. Gwyneth was right behind him when the shark came back around. It caught her across the back of her left calf before she wrenched herself free and Kurt pulled her aboard. She collapsed onto the deck as the shark's momentum carried it past the hull. Phil and Elena were still in the water. The shark came from below and to Phil's left. It struck him across the left hip and lower torso. He remained at the surface for a few seconds as the water around him darkened quickly. Elena was about 15 feet away. She froze for a moment and the shark caught her across the upper right thigh. She disappeared briefly beneath the surface before resurfacing face up, her arms moving without any clear direction. The deckhand threw a life ring toward Phil. It landed within arm's reach, but Phil didn't take it.
This is the point where people usually start imagining what they would have done differently. The problem is that events like this unfold much faster than they seem to hindsight.
The captain was on the radio by 2:53. He watched Phil stop moving. He watched Elena struggle to stay afloat. He watched the dorsal fin cut a slow arc between them and the yacht. Neither of them made it back. Phil was found floating face down about 180 feet from the yacht. Elena was recovered roughly 40 feet away after spending 22 minutes in the water. Resuscitation efforts aboard the rescue vessel were unsuccessful. Harbor Patrol arrived at 3:19, 26 minutes after the distress call. The shark was still nearby and spotted within 80 feet of the recovery site. No divers entered the water. Phil and Elena were recovered from the surface, while Kurt and Gwyneth were taken ashore for treatment. A later survey deemed the damaged yacht a total loss. Phil's injuries were concentrated around the left hip and lower torso. The bite measured about 19 inches across, consistent with a great white shark Carcharodon carcharias, estimated at 13 to 15 feet. The left iliac artery had been completely severed. The coroner ruled the cause of death hemorrhagic shock and noted that survival was unlikely regardless of response time. Elena's cause of death was also hemorrhagic shock. The bite to her upper right thigh had lacerated the femoral artery, and the blood loss sustained during the 22 minutes she spent in the water was determined to be unsurvivable. Kurt was treated for a deep forearm laceration. Gwyneth suffered a bite wound to the left calf and a shoulder dislocation. Both survived and eventually recovered. The case was classified as a predatory great white shark attack that resulted in 2 deaths and 2 non-fatal injuries. It was August 16, 2022, on a rural property outside Springfield, Missouri. Aslan Malachi was 46 years old and worked as a building contractor. Most days were spent managing projects, meeting clients, and traveling between construction sites. Several years earlier, though, a vacation had changed the direction of his life completely. During a trip to Africa, Aslan visited a wildlife facility and became fascinated by lions. He spent hours watching them and talking with the handlers there. The experience stayed with him long after he flew home. What started as admiration slowly grew into something closer to an obsession. A few years later, he legally acquired a young male lion and brought it back to his property. The lion quickly became the center of his life. At first, the animal was small enough to handle easily. Aslan spent hours feeding it and caring for it and showing pictures of it to anyone who would look. As the lion grew, he spent thousands of dollars building a large enclosure behind the house designed to keep the animal secure while still giving it room to move. The lion grew into roughly 400 pounds of muscle and instinct that never fully left him, no matter how tame he seemed. A single vacation reshaping the entire direction of someone's life. I think about how often that happens with a brief encounter that turns into a years-long obsession nobody saw coming. Many people questioned whether keeping an animal like that was a good idea. Aslan always gave the same answer. He had raised the lion himself. The animal recognized his voice and took food from his hand and had never seriously threatened him. Years passed without incident, and that history made Aslan more and more confident.
To him, the lion was not just an exotic pet.
It was something closer to family, something he believed he understood better than anyone else could. As the years went by, the enclosure began showing its age. Rain and changing temperatures and rust slowly wore down parts of the structure. One of the gate latches became loose. Aslan noticed it and told himself he would fix it soon, but other jobs kept getting in the way. Every time he looked at it, he convinced himself it would hold a little longer. I think about how many small repairs sit on a list for months because nothing bad has happened yet. He just needed to fix it. On the 16th of August, Aslan took the day off and stayed home. He spent the morning relaxing around the house while the lion stayed inside its enclosure out back. At some point that afternoon, the weakened latch finally gave out. The gate shifted open, just enough for the lion to push through it. Once outside the enclosure, the animal wandered across the property and eventually made its way to the house itself. Inside, Aslan had no idea anything was wrong. He was alone that day. A short while later, he stepped out of the bathroom
and walked into the hallway, and that was when he saw the lion standing less than 10 feet away.
inside his own house, blocking the path to the front door. For a moment, neither of them moved, and in that silence, Aslan made the mistake of locking eyes with it before slowly stepping backward toward the bedroom. The lion's ears flattened against its skull, and its weight shifted low onto its front legs, and then it came at him in a single explosive burst, covering the distance in under 2 seconds. Lions can sprint at roughly 50 miles per hour over short distances despite their enormous size. It hit him chest first with the full weight of its body, slamming him backward into the wall before he even got a hand up, and the impact alone was enough to knock him to the floor.
Once he was down, the lion clamped its jaw around his throat and shoulder and did not let go.
And the bite from an animal that size carries enough force to crush bone and sever major blood vessels almost instantly. He had no door to shut and no weapon within reach, and nothing in the house built to stop 400 pounds of muscle once it decided to commit. Then he became unconscious. He walked out of his own bathroom into a hallway that suddenly held a 400-pound predator. There was no version of that hallway he could have prepared for. Hours later, his colleagues grew concerned when they could not reach him. Repeated calls went unanswered, which was unusual for him. Eventually, someone asked authorities to perform a welfare check. When officers arrived, they found the damaged enclosure gate and realized the lion was no longer secured. Emergency services were called immediately. Inside the house, responders found Aslan with fatal injuries. Because the lion was still loose on the property and posed a danger to emergency workers and nearby residents, authorities made the decision to shoot and kill the animal. Investigators later concluded that the tragedy began with a maintenance problem that had simply been left unrepaired. The lion had not escaped through some complicated failure or freak event. One weakened latch had finally given way and let one of the world's largest predators walk straight into a house.